What about the Dutch Air Force during the Second World War? What role did Dutch pilots play during the German invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940? What about Dutch pilots in Allied ranks? And what about the Dutch Air Force in the East Indies? More on all that right now. Good to have you back on the channel. If you're new, I'm Stefan. I'm a Dutch history teacher and I love to explore historical topics regarding the Netherlands, regarding World War II, among other things. If you find that content interesting and you have not subscribed yet, please do so. You can also support me financially via Patreon, PayPal, via Super Thanks, or you can buy me a coffee. The Netherlands maintained a neutral position during World War I, and the Army Aviation Group did not take part in any action. Instead, they focused on developing the force's capabilities. Pilot training was opened and established for ranks including officers in technical, aerial photography, meteorological, and navigation flights. Because of the war, it was difficult to acquire suitable aircraft. At the end of World War I, the Dutch government cut the defense budget and the Army Aviation Group was almost dissolved. Political tensions in Europe increased. In the 1930s, the Dutch government tried to rebuild its army and also its air force. But by this point, by 1938, there were severe problems. A shortage of pilot instructors, navigators, and pilots to fly the new multiple-engine aircraft. Lack of standardization and resulting maintenance issue added to the complexity of rebuilding tasks. As war loomed in July 1939, the Army Aviation Group was renamed the Army Aviation Brigade. In August 1939, the Dutch government mobilized its armed forces, but due to the limited budget, the Army Aviation Brigade operated a limited number of combat aircraft. I read different numbers ranging from a total number of 120 to 180 and thus also different numbers regarding types of aircraft. Even the Dutch and English Wikipedia pages are not on the same page. And I found this source in this book and this one in that book. Either way, the Dutch had the following type of aircraft. The Fokker T5 type bomber, the Fokker D.XXI single-engine fighter, the Fokker G.I twin-engine fighter, the Fokker D.XXI single-engine fighter, the Douglas DB-8A3N light bomber, the Fokker C-10 light bomber, the Fokker C-5 reconnaissance aircraft, and the Koolhoven FK-51 artillery observer aircraft. Most operational bases for the military aviation was located in Fortress Holland. These bases did become a target by the Germans when they invaded the country on the 10th of May 1940. With the help of airborne troops and air landing troops, the Germans tried to take the military airfields around Den Haag. Their goal was to secure the airfields, fly in reinforcements, and then march off to Den Haag, capture the city, and also the Dutch government, Dutch military high command, as well as the Dutch Queen. Now in another video I talk about this battle in which the Germans failed. Many German aircraft were destroyed and paratroopers either killed, captured or wounded. Let's focus on the action of the Dutch Air Force in May 1940. As soon as the Germans invaded, it took a while for the Dutch to overcome the surprise and get their military aircraft in the air. Much of the Dutch planes were destroyed while standing on the ground by German bombing and strafing actions. And the Dutch had a severe lack of fighter planes. The Douglas 8A3N was a reconnaissance plane but used as a fighter, but not suitable for this job as it stood no chance against the German Messerschmitt planes of the Luftwaffe. I read that after the first attack, only 13 of the 62 Dutch fighter planes were able to take off. Most fighters were deployed to escort bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. More of Dutch fighters were shot down. However, Dutch technicians managed to repair some lightly damaged airplanes. At the end of May 10th, a number of 44 fighters were lost. Also, many bombers went down. Truth be told, the Germans suffered a higher number of plane losses, but they could make up for these losses and the Dutch could not. Now the Dutch reconnaissance aircraft, they suffered less, but they got overwhelmed by the endless demands of reconnaissance flights. The Dutch carried out bombings on different airfields captured by the Germans. Ypenburg Ypenburg, Valkenburg, and Waalhaven, as well as the dune area where German transport planes had landed. Now, many of these Dutch airfields that fell into German hands pretty quick were later that day recaptured by the Dutch. On the 11th of May, early morning, the Dutch reorganized their air force. Till the Dutch capitulation, their task was to bomb strategic areas such as the Moerdijk Bridge and the German positions near the Grebbelijn and Afsluitdijk. The last T-5 bombers were lost, and it was apparent the Germans ruled the skies. On the 13th of May, the Grebbelijn was breached. The following day, Rotterdam was bombed, and on May 15th, the Netherlands capitulated, with the exception of the province of Zeeland, which capitulated a few days later. In total, the Dutch lost 94 planes, the Germans 350. Most of these were the G.XXI transport planes. Now, did many Dutch aircraft manage to get away to Britain once the Netherlands capitulated? Well, the answer is no. Much of the Dutch aircraft were destroyed by its own crew, so these would not fall into the hands of the Germans. The Netherlands Naval Aviation Service managed to fly to Britain with some Fokker D.XXIs, and one C-10 managed to reach Britain as well. Just a few Dutch aircraft managed to make the crossing to Allied lines in Britain. But truth be told, the Dutch planes were fairly obsolete. So even if the Dutch were able to get a higher number of their planes across the channel, it would be very unlikely these would be of much use for the Allies. Yet if it was not for the aircraft, its personnel would have been useful for the Allied cause in the future. Only the aircraft service of the Navy managed to fly a substantial amount of its personnel across the channel. So what happened with this crew that made it across the channel? Well, Dutch minister in exile, Dijkshoorn, he wanted the Dutch pilots to be absorbed into the British RAF. But the British, they preferred the Dutch to be trained in Canada. On the 25th of June, the British, they announced that some of the Dutch pilots could be absorbed into the RAF. The Dutch government, they asked for other alternatives. And eventually, it was agreed that the Dutch pilots could be trained in Canada, in Newfoundland. The Dutch responded enthusiastically because now their identity would remain, instead of just being absorbed into the British ranks. But the Dutch government actually was not satisfied and wanted its crew to be transferred to the Dutch East Indies that was not yet occupied by Japan. But at the end, only 4 Dutch pilots volunteered to be transferred to East Asia. Mid-July, it appeared that the British 320 Squadron was facing personnel shortages, so the Dutch government asked if Dutch pilots could be absorbed within this formation. At the end, a substantial amount did join this squadron. They were transferred to Canada for future training. Others went to the Dutch East Indies. Prince Bernhard, the husband of Princess and future Queen Juliana, lobbied for a Dutch squadron in the RAF, and eventually the 322nd Dutch Squadron was established. Later, the 167th Squadron would be placed in the 322nd Dutch Squadron, although it must be noted that the 322nd was never fully Dutch, as it still had many British pilots in its ranks. Much time was spent in mastering the skills of flying with the British Spitfire planes. Money was collected from the Dutch colonies to purchase more of these aircraft. During the war, the Dutch aircraft mostly escorted bombers that were tasked to take out the V-1 launching sites in France. With their so-called anti-diver operations, they tried to take out the V-1s. Many of these V-1 rockets were shot out of the sky with machine guns on board, but others were thrown off course by tipping the wing of the V-1. The Germans later installed a mechanism that made the V-1 explode once it would be touched in the air. In September 1944, the Dutch 322nd Squadron took place in the airborne operations around Arnhem. At the end of that year, the first Dutch planes landed on liberated Dutch soil. In the meanwhile, the unit was part of the 2nd Tactical Air Force, and pilots were trained for escorts and defensive patrols, so-called fighter sweeps, as well as armed patrols and bombings on strategic areas. Later, it was transferred to Germany to take part in the final battles against the Third Reich. It would remain there for some time after World War II in Europe was over. till October 1945, and later these pilots would be absorbed in the ranks of the new Dutch Air Force. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, the Dutch did not only have an air force in Europe, but also in Southeast Asia, in the Dutch East Indies, current Indonesia to be precisely. Here, the ML-KNIL was the Dutch Air Force that served in the Dutch East Indies. They possessed 324 planes. Much of these were obsolete, and other more modern aircraft were ordered but had not been delivered yet by the North Americans. The ML-KNIL consisted of Glen Martin bombers, Brewster Buffalo fighters, Curtiss Interceptor Hawk fighters, and Curtiss Falcon light reconnaissance aircraft. Expected to be delivered were 162 Brewster Bermuda dive bombers, as well as 162 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers. Major General Ludolf Hendrik van Ooyen went to the US in September 1941 to urge fast delivery. Van Ooyen was actually in Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attack commenced in December 1941. He did manage to reach the Dutch East Indies after that. Much Dutch aircraft supported the British at Singapore. The goal of the ML-KNIL was to bomb the Japanese advances in the outer regions. The Dutch aircraft succeeded to bomb the Japanese fleet near Miri, British Borneo, and damaged some ships. Soon the Dutch base of Singkawan on Borneo was evacuated and its aircraft were transferred to Palembang on Sumatra. By joining forces in the Abdacom, the Allies hoped to halt the Japanese onslaught, but to no avail. Borneo was soon abandoned and other islands and its remaining aircraft withdrawn to Java. In February, 1 month before the surrender of Java, Dutch instructors and its students went to Australia to continue the fight from there. Abdacom was dissolved that month. Dutch bombers did try to bomb Japanese positions on Java, but on March 8th, Java was lost to Japan. In South Australia, the 18th Squadron was established. This formation was joined by Dutch aviation students that had managed to make their way out of the Dutch East Indies. They formed the Royal Netherlands Military Flying School, the RNMFS. It was decided to continue the education in the United States. The United States was out of reach for Japanese bombers and had good facilities. The Americans offered the Jackson Army Air Force Base in Mississippi. Its first commander, Van Ooyen, was later succeeded by Colonel Koenraad Giebel. The flight training started in June 1942 with the Fairchild PT-19A and later the Vultee BT-13A. From its initial 320 trainees, 44% dropped out. February 1944, the last trainings were completed and the education center was shut down. In April 1942, the 18th Netherlands East Indies Squadron was established, which functioned within the ranks of the Royal Australian Air Force. Canberra became its base and its first commander, Major B.F. Fieldey. It was a Dutch unit within the ranks of the RAAF. Already in June, they carried out their first operations against a Japanese submarine, which was successful. During the war, the 18th Squadron carried out patrols and attacked enemy ships. In April 1945, they attacked the Japanese cruiser Isuzu and managed to inflict much damage. The cruiser was later sunk by a US submarine. In total, the squadron lost over 90 men, Dutch and Australian. In December 1943, the 120th Netherlands East Indies Squadron was founded under Major Maurenbrecher, also based in Australia. They later transferred to Morocco in New Guinea, but the squadron did not take part in action. It was declared non-operational early 1945, but later reactivated and took part in several engagements. Towards the end of the war in Asia, the 19th Squadron was set up. It had no fighting duties, but was established to transport people, and it played an important role of transporting Dutch former prisoners of war as well as other internees out of the Dutch East Indies. The Flying Dutchman also made its presence felt in the East, from the first to the last day, and in a way that commanded respect from the Allies. There's people that claim that the inflicted losses on the Germans during their invasion of the Netherlands had a role in not carrying out the invasion of the British mainland and influenced future campaigns. To what extent this is true, you find right here. And I made a video here about the Japanese invasion of the Dutch East Indies, a detailed overview of the Dutch East Indies campaign 41-42. Thank you so much for watching. Tot de volgende keer.